started with a whisper. "She's clearly not supposed to be here." Not yelled, not even loud, just sharp enough to sting, just cruel enough to cut through the calm of the first-class cabin. Nia's fingers tightened around her teddy bear. She turned to look up at me, eyes wide, lips slightly parted. She wasn't crying, but she was close. That kind of confusion only a child knows, when the world suddenly feels off and no one explains why. I didn't speak. Not yet. The flight attendant was still standing there, blocking our path, smiling that cold, polished kind of smile people use when they think they're right. She had no idea who I was, and even less idea who Nia was. The air inside the cabin had shifted. Heads turned subtly. Phones lowered. The silence wasn't complete, but it was listening. My daughter didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel it. That's the cruelty of moments like this. Even if a child doesn't know the words, they still carry the weight. It was a fresh Monday morning in San Diego. The terminal buzzed with the usual rhythm of travelers. Heels clacking, suitcases rolling, voices rising and falling like a low tide. Nia was radiant in her yellow sundress, her curls tied into two playful puffs, skipping beside me with her roller bag bouncing slightly behind. Her bear wore a little pilot hat she'd insisted on adding the night before. I let her take the lead, smiling quietly. I wore a simple navy polo, dark jeans, and sneakers. No watch, no briefcase, no signs of who I was. I didn't want attention. I never did. Most people wouldn't recognize me outside a boardroom, and that was exactly how I liked it. Just a regular father taking his daughter on one last trip before summer ended. No press, no entourage, just me, Nia, and a plane. My plane. Starglide Air. The airline I'd built from the ground up. The airline that carried my name on every boarding pass, even when I chose not to use it. We stepped onto the jet bridge toward first class, our boarding passes ready. The hush of the cabin greeted us. Leather seats, cool lighting, warm greetings. Passengers were already sipping juice, flipping through magazines, or adjusting neck pillows. And then she stepped in. Blonde, sharp eyes, burgundy lipstick, hair tightly pinned into a smooth bun, her uniform crisp, her name tag read Heather. She saw us before we even crossed the threshold. Something flickered in her gaze. A tightening, a mental calculation. She walked toward us, brisk, official, but with a current of something unspoken. "Excuse me," she said, stopping in front of us with a practiced smile. "First class is for premium passengers only." I nodded, polite, and handed her our passes. "We are in first class." But Heather wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were locked on Nia, and her smile shifted. "I'm sorry, sir, but children flying coach can't linger here. We need to keep this area clear before departure. If you'll follow me to your seats in economy." Nia's roller bag tilted awkwardly behind her as she turned toward me. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" Around us, the mood began to tighten. The quiet wasn't gentle anymore. It was cautious. I bent down beside her and brushed a curl behind her ear. "No, sweetheart. We didn't do anything wrong at all." I stood back up and handed Heather the boarding passes again, more firmly this time. Her eyes flicked over them, quick, careless. She didn't really read, just enough to pretend. "There must be a mistake," she said, voice light but loaded. "Possibly an accidental upgrade. But this section is for our premium guests. We try to maintain a certain standard." She said standard like it meant something I'd never understand. Like we weren't part of it. Her gaze slid back to Nia with a hint of something worse than doubt. Dismissal. Around us, the subtle hum of the cabin changed. The man in seat 2B lowered his newspaper. A woman nearby paused mid-sip of her latte. A couple to our left exchanged a quiet look. I could feel Nia's hand trembling in mine now. The bear in her other hand drooped slightly, its stitched smile oblivious to what was unfolding. My own chest tightened, not with anger but with that old bitter familiarity. The one that creeps in when you realize someone doesn't see your worth unless it's stamped on your forehead. I kept my voice calm. "I'd like to speak to the captain." Heather's smile thinned. "He's preparing for departure, sir." I don't think this requires his attention. I didn't blink. I didn't move. And then, as if on cue, the cockpit door clicked open. A tall man in uniform stepped out, First Officer Blake. His eyes scanned the scene, then dropped to the boarding passes in Heather's hand. His brow furrowed slightly. He said nothing at first, just reached forward, took the passes and looked at them properly. His expression changed the moment he saw the name. That was the moment everything began to shift. The co-pilot stood still for a moment, boarding passes in hand. His eyes flicked from the printed names to my face, then back again. Something in his posture changed. His breath caught just slightly, but it was enough. The recognition settled like a drop of ink in clear water. Fast, irreversible. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, almost too low for others to hear. I didn't realize." His voice cracked on the second word. Heather turned to him sharply, brows drawing in. "What's the issue?" she asked, still clinging to her confident tone, even as the edges frayed. The co-pilot took a breath, then straightened. His voice was calm but firm. "Heather, this is Darius Thompson. He's the CEO of Starglide Air." Silence rippled out like shockwaves. The nearby passengers who had been pretending not to listen now looked directly at us. One man's jaw dropped slightly. A woman clutched her purse tighter, as if the air had suddenly become more fragile. Heather froze. The blood drained from her face so quickly it was almost visible. "He's your boss," the co-pilot added. A final, unavoidable truth. And just like that, the mask slipped. Heather's smile dissolved. Her hands dropped to her sides, and she took a tiny half-step back, as if the words had physically struck her. Nia looked up at me, puzzled but sensing the shift in energy. She didn't know what CEO meant yet. She just knew something important had changed. Heather opened her mouth, closed it again, then gave a nervous little laugh. "Too thin, too late." "Oh, I didn't recognize you, Mr. Thompson. I'm so sorry. This was just a misunderstanding." Her voice pitched up, a kind of shaky sweetness laced with fear. But I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I just met her eyes and said quietly, "It wasn't a misunderstanding. You made an assumption." The words landed with precision, not cruel but clear. Heather's lips parted, then pressed shut. She looked at Nia, trying to smile. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said, voice wobbling. Nia didn't reply. She just hugged her bear tighter, her little arms wound protectively around it. I could feel the cabin watching, not with open judgment but with something quieter, reconsideration, maybe guilt. I turned to the co-pilot. "I'd like to speak to the head of the cabin crew before takeoff." He nodded without hesitation. "Of course. I'll get her right away." And just like that, he turned and disappeared down the aisle. Heather remained standing there, rooted in place, her hands now clasped in front of her, visibly trembling. No more lines. No more false charm. She looked like she wanted to vanish into the carpet. Around us, the buzz of quiet conversation began again. Not loud, but enough to know this moment had made impact. A child in 3A whispered something to their father. A woman across the aisle gave me a nod, subtle but deliberate. Within a minute, a second flight attendant approached briskly. She was older than Heather, with silver streaks in her dark hair, her expression composed but firm. "Mr. Thompson," she said calmly. "I'm Carla Jennings, the lead on this flight. I understand there's been an issue." I explained what had happened, briefly, factually, without embellishment. Carla's face darkened slightly as I spoke. She didn't interrupt, didn't glance at Heather. When I finished, she nodded once and turned. "Heather," she said evenly, "I need to see you in the galley. Now." Heather didn't move. Carla's voice dropped half a register. "Now." Slowly, with her eyes on the carpet, Heather turned and walked back through the cabin. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. The aisle seemed longer now, like it would never end. Carla turned back to me. "Mr. Thompson, please accept my sincere apology on behalf of our crew. We'll make sure you and your daughter are taken care of properly." I gave her a small nod. "Thank you." Then I looked at Nia. Ready to sit down, sweetheart? She nodded silently, and I led her to our seats, 2D and 2F, right by the window. The leather was smooth and cool, and I helped her climb up into hers before settling in beside her. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The hum of the engines hadn't started yet, but the weight of everything lingered in the air. Then Nia leaned closer and whispered, "Daddy, why was she so mean to us?" I paused, brushing my hand over her hair. "Sometimes people judge others without knowing who they really are," I said gently. "But that says more about them than it does about us." Nia nodded slowly, her brow still furrowed but thoughtful. She pulled her bear into her lap and looked out the window. The airport lights shimmered beyond the glass, quiet and distant, and for the first time since we boarded, her shoulders relaxed just a little. As we settled into our seats, the atmosphere in the cabin hadn't quite returned to normal. There was still a buzz, a current of quiet energy that passed from row to row like a shared breath. Passengers leaned back, but their eyes flicked toward us more often than they looked out the window. Some curious, some embarrassed, some trying not to look at all but failing. I could feel it even with my head turned, the weight of attention pressing lightly against my back. Nia tucked her bear into the crook of her arm and stared straight ahead. Her feet didn't quite touch the floor, and she swung them slowly, as if searching for a rhythm she'd lost the moment we were stopped. The engines hadn't started yet. There was still a window of pause before departure. And in that pause, everything lingered. The words, the glances, the assumption. I didn't like scenes. I never had. But this wasn't about making one. This was about making sure it wouldn't happen again. Not to Nia. Not to anyone. A few minutes passed, then Carla reappeared. Calm, composed, still carrying that air of someone who knew when and how to take charge. This time, she carried 2 glasses of sparkling water, beads of condensation tracing paths down the crystal. In her other hand, a small snack tray with warm mixed nuts, dried fruit, and a chocolate chip cookie that looked freshly baked. She placed the tray on the fold-out between our seats, her tone warm but purposeful. "Mr. Thompson, Miss Nia, we want to make sure your flight is as comfortable as possible. If there's anything you need, just let us know." She smiled, genuinely this time, and added, "We'll be departing shortly." Nia's eyes lit up at the cookie, but she looked to me first, almost asking for permission. I gave a small nod, and she reached for it, cradling it in her napkin as though it were something fragile. She turned to her bear and whispered, "See, we didn't do anything wrong." Her voice was quiet, but I heard it. I felt it. That small confirmation from her, spoken more to herself than anyone else, meant more to me than any corporate statement ever could. The plane began to push back from the gate. Outside the window, the tarmac moved beneath us as the engines finally roared to life. As the plane gained speed, I stared ahead for a long moment, then reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Not out of anger, out of purpose. My thumbs moved quickly, composing an email to the head of HR. No dramatic language, just a clear, detailed account of what had happened. Heather's words, her tone, the sequence, the impact. I included only the facts, but the facts were enough. I didn't send it right away. I read it over twice. Then I looked at Nia. Her eyes were closed now, the cookie half-eaten on the tray, her bear tucked under one arm. She leaned into the side of the seat, and I gently pulled the blanket over her legs. She looked peaceful, but I knew this moment had left its mark. Even if she didn't fully understand what had happened yet, the sting of being told, "You don't belong here," would echo somewhere inside her. The plane reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt light dimmed. The hum of the cabin returned, but softer now, more hushed. A few passengers made eye contact with me as they passed. Subtle nods, brief murmurs of respect, not loud but meaningful. I returned each with the same quiet acknowledgement. I wasn't looking for applause. I wasn't interested in attention. But I wanted them to remember the silence before they looked away, the assumptions before the truth. Far in the back of the plane, I knew Heather was sitting alone, likely in the galley. The door would be closed now, but the discomfort in that space would be thicker than turbulence. Her actions wouldn't just be forgotten when the wheels touched down. There would be consequences. Not because I demanded them, but because they were necessary. Growth didn't come from warnings. It came from accountability. I looked back down at my screen and tapped send. Then I exhaled. The flight continued without incident. Nia slept quietly, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the engine. I didn't move. I let her stay curled against me as long as she needed. I didn't need food. I didn't need a drink. I needed her to feel safe again. Somewhere over Colorado, the clouds outside turned golden. I reached up and adjusted the window shade, letting just enough light spill in to keep her warm. And as I watched her sleep, calm now, untouched by the looks, the whispers, the judgment, I made a quiet promise. This wouldn't be forgotten. Not by me, and not by Starglide Air. By the time the plane began its gradual descent, Nia was awake again, stretching slowly in her seat and blinking at the soft orange light pouring in through the window. Her bear was still tucked under one arm, the cookie tray now empty except for a few crumbs. I watched her quietly as she turned her face toward the glass, mesmerized by the patchwork of city lights far below. For a while, neither of us spoke. The cabin had grown calm, but not unaware. People were still glancing, still stealing quiet looks. Not out of malice now, but memory. Then Carla returned. She approached our row with the same grace she'd shown earlier, her hands clasped gently in front of her. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "I wanted to let you know that we've reported the incident to Starglide Management. Heather will be addressed as soon as we land." I gave her a small nod. "Thank you," I replied, calm but clear. "I'll be following up personally." Carla nodded once more, then turned away to continue final checks down the aisle. As we taxied to the gate, a few passengers began to stir, collecting coats, powering phones, gathering bags from under seats. Nia sat still. She looked up at me with wide, searching eyes. "Daddy," she asked quietly, "are we going to fly on your planes again?" Her voice wasn't frightened. It was curious, honest. I smiled and squeezed her hand gently. "Of course we are, sweetheart," I said. "But next time, people like Heather will think twice before treating anyone unfairly." The plane came to a full stop at the gate. The seatbelt light chimed off. Passengers rose slowly, some still stealing cautious glances our way. And then, one by one, a few of them began to approach. A tall man with silver-rimmed glasses paused beside me. "That was handled with class, sir," he said quietly, offering a respectful nod. Behind him, a woman with a sleeping toddler on her hip added, "You've got a strong little girl there." I thanked them politely, keeping my focus on Nia, who now stood beside me, teddy bear clutched in both arms. Her expression was proud, but not boastful, just steady. We stepped off the plane together. At the exit, the entire cabin crew stood in a formal line. Most had their eyes forward. Heather was among them, her posture rigid, her gaze firmly on the floor. She didn't look up as we passed, but Carla did. She gave Nia a warm, silent nod as we exited the door. Outside the gate, a man in a charcoal gray suit waited near the jet bridge. His stance was alert but composed. The moment he saw me, he stepped forward with urgency. Not panic, just gravity. "Mr. Thompson," he said, offering his hand. "I'm Marcus Weller, Regional Operations Manager. I was alerted before your flight landed. Please allow me to extend our sincerest apologies." He looked genuinely shaken. "This isn't how we treat our passengers. Or anyone." I nodded, still holding Nia's hand. "Then make sure it doesn't happen again," I said, my voice low but even. "I expect a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning." "No summaries." "I want facts and accountability." "Understood," Marcus replied, already making mental notes. And again, "I'm truly sorry." We left the terminal without saying another word. Just a father and his daughter walking together, heads held high. I opened the door to the black SUV waiting curbside and helped Nia climb in. As we pulled away from the airport, she turned toward me. The headlights from another car swept softly across her face. "Daddy, will she lose her job?" Her voice was soft, hesitant. She wasn't angry. She was wondering. I paused, then answered slowly. "That depends on company policy, sweetheart. But what matters more is that she learns from this. Everyone deserves a chance to grow, but they also have to face the consequences of their choices." Nia nodded thoughtfully and leaned her head against the window. The city lights reflected in her eyes, and I could see the questions still swirling in her mind, but also the strength settling into her chest. The next morning, I walked into Starglide's headquarters with a clear agenda. My assistant handed me a printed report already waiting on my desk. I read every word. No one tried to downplay it. No one made excuses. That, at least, was a start. But it wasn't enough. By noon, I had called a mandatory meeting for all senior cabin staff. We didn't talk about Heather directly. We talked about culture, bias, customer care. We reviewed footage, role-played scenarios, rebuilt expectations. Later that afternoon, I joined the training session myself. I stood in front of the room. No slides, no podium, just me, a whiteboard, and a room full of flight attendants who'd heard the story from the ground crew, the passengers, or the video already spreading online. I didn't repeat what happened. I didn't have to. I told them what should have happened, what would now be expected. And when I looked around the room, I saw it in their faces. The discomfort, the reflection, the quiet resolve. No one would forget this lesson. Meanwhile, the video passengers had recorded mid-flight began to circulate. You could hear Heather's voice clearly, the condescension, the tone. You could hear my calm response. You could see Nia looking up, clutching her bear. That contrast, her innocence, Heather's certainty, my refusal to raise my voice, was what hit people hardest. The clip went viral. Fast. And not just because I was CEO, but because anyone could see themselves in it. The public response poured in. Messages from other parents, from pilots, from strangers. People weren't outraged because I was a public figure. They were outraged because they understood the story without needing a title. It was a story they'd lived, or feared, or seen before. The official company statement came out 2 days later. It acknowledged the incident. It detailed the action plan. It included Heather's suspension and mandatory retraining. Whether she'd return to her position remained uncertain. But the message was clear. Assumptions have consequences. Weeks passed. The video didn't disappear. It kept resurfacing on news outlets, in diversity seminars, in quiet living rooms where parents sat with their kids to talk about dignity. The moment between Nia, me, and Heather had become something larger than just one flight. It had turned into a lesson, a mirror, a pause in the noise of daily life where people stopped, if only for a moment, to reconsider how they treated others. At Starglide Air, the impact was immediate. We launched a revised training program, led in person by a rotating team of executives and cabin leaders. Not with scripts, not with bullet points, but with real conversations, real scenarios. Heather's name was never mentioned directly, but her choices were studied, broken down, reframed, not to shame her, but to show how subtle actions can leave deep scars. Public support poured in. Not for me, but for Nia. Her face, captured in that short clip, had struck a chord. The innocence, the quiet strength, the confusion followed by understanding. People sent letters, drawings, messages from teachers saying they'd played the clip in class. From flight crews who'd changed the way they greeted passengers. From parents who told their kids, "See this? This is what standing tall looks like." I didn't respond to every message, but I read them all. Late at night, after meetings were done and lights in the house were low, I'd sit with a mug of tea and scroll through them slowly. There was so much pain buried in some of those words. But there was hope too. People didn't want apologies. They wanted change. And that, finally, was something I could promise. As for Nia, she grew. Not just taller, though that too, but inwardly, quietly, gracefully. She didn't bring up the flight often, but when she did, her tone was thoughtful, measured. She didn't ask why Heather acted the way she did. She asked how to make sure others didn't do the same. And that difference, that shift from pain to purpose, was what made me prouder than anything else. Years passed, and one spring afternoon, I found myself sitting in the front row of a large university auditorium. The seats around me filled with proud families, graduates adjusting their caps, professors in gowns. Nia stood behind the curtain, waiting to be called. Valedictorian, the top of her class. The little girl who once clutched her bear in first class now stood poised to speak to hundreds. When her name echoed through the hall, she stepped forward with quiet confidence. Her gown flowed gracefully behind her, and her curls, longer now, framed her face in soft spirals. She paused at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the crowd. Then her eyes found mine. We held that look for a beat, and then she began. She didn't start with numbers, or awards, or goals. She started with a memory. When I was 10, she said, her voice steady, a flight attendant looked at me and decided I didn't belong. Not because of what I said, not because of anything I'd done, but because of how I looked. She told me to go to the back of the plane. But what she didn't know was that the man standing beside me owned the plane. There was a pause. Not awkward, just enough to let it land. But I didn't tell this story to get sympathy. I'm telling it because that moment taught me something I'll never forget. That we are often judged not by who we are, but by what others assume. And while we can't control their assumptions, we can control our response. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand a scene. He stood firm. He told the truth. And in doing so, he taught me that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands. The room was silent, not because they weren't moved, but because they were, deeply. And then, the applause rose like a wave, slow at first, then rising, then roaring. I couldn't stop smiling, not because she'd made a great speech, but because she'd turned pain into purpose, quiet injustice into powerful clarity. She hadn't just remembered the moment. She had claimed it, rewritten it, shared it not as a wound but as a guidepost. After the ceremony, people came up to her with tears in their eyes. Some asked questions. Some just hugged her. I stood nearby, watching, knowing full well that this was no longer just my story to tell. It had become hers, and she was carrying it with more grace than I ever could have imagined. That night, at the dinner celebration with close friends and family, I pulled her aside. We stood near a balcony overlooking the city skyline, the wind soft against our coats. "You've become everything I ever hoped for," I told her. And more. She didn't say thank you. She said, "I learned from the best, Dad." And for a moment I said nothing, just looked at her, this brilliant, strong, fiercely compassionate woman, and knew with complete certainty that no matter where she went from here, she'd always carry the lessons of that day in first class, not as a burden, but as a compass. Months passed, and the story of that flight remained in quiet motion. Not in headlines anymore, but in policy changes, in new hire orientations, in the small decisions people made differently each day. At Starglide Air, we didn't build statues. We rebuilt expectations. What happened on that plane had become more than a moment. It had become part of our DNA. And not just ours. Other airlines reached out, asking to share the training modules we developed. Universities used the case in business ethics courses. Industry conferences referenced it without needing to name names. Everyone knew the story. Then came the gala. It was our annual company event, an evening meant to celebrate growth, resilience, and the people behind the wings. The ballroom shimmered with warm gold lighting. Executives mingled with flight attendants, engineers with gate agents. There was laughter, toasts, but underneath it all there was something deeper, a collective awareness of how far we'd come. I stood near the back watching for a while, letting others speak, letting the spotlight fall where it should. Then, as the final speech was about to begin, I stepped on stage. The room quieted. Cameras panned. I adjusted the microphone, then let the pause stretch for just a second longer than usual. "Tonight," I began, "we honor progress. Not perfection. Progress. The kind that doesn't just come from systems but from people. The kind that starts with a question and becomes a promise. I let the room breathe with me. And tonight, I continued, I want to introduce someone who represents that promise. Someone who reminds us that leadership isn't about title, but about heart. I turned to the side of the stage. Please welcome my daughter, Nia Thompson. The applause began before she even stepped into view. And when she did, graceful, poised, radiant in a midnight blue dress, every head turned. Not because of who she was to me, but because of who she'd become. She walked across the stage, heels silent on the polished floor, and took the microphone with steady hands. Many of you know me as Darius Thompson's daughter, she began, her voice clear. But years ago, I was just a little girl denied a seat in first class. Not because we didn't have the right ticket, but because of how I looked. The room stilled. That moment could have made me bitter, she continued. But instead, it became the foundation of who I am. My father taught me that leadership isn't about power. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching. And that's the kind of legacy we're building here at Starglide Air. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone carried weight. She spoke of her studies, her work in inclusive design, her passion for making systems not just fair but kind. And when she finished, the room stood. Not just the board. Not just the crew. Everyone. After the event, I watched as she moved through the crowd. People leaned in to hear her. Not because she was famous, but because she was real, and humble, and sharp in all the right ways. One flight attendant pulled her aside, misty-eyed. I applied here because of you, she said. Your story, it changed everything. Later that night, as the ballroom emptied and the lights dimmed, we stood together on the terrace. The city stretched out before us, quiet and glittering. Nia leaned against the railing, arms crossed loosely, her breath forming soft clouds in the cool air. Dad, she said after a while, I've been thinking. I turned toward her. I want to take a bigger role in the company, not just because it's ours, but because I believe in what we're doing. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, fully, completely. The little girl with the bear was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd seen the world clearly and chose to make it better. I was hoping you'd say that, I said, and that was it. A moment passed between us. Not ceremonial, not dramatic, just honest. A quiet changing of seasons. In the years that followed, Nia became a cornerstone of the company. She didn't chase headlines. She built systems. She mentored young recruits. She redesigned the onboarding process with empathy at its center. And when people spoke her name, they didn't say, the CEO's daughter. They said, our leader. We didn't talk much about the day on the plane anymore. But we didn't have to. It lived in everything. In the way passengers were greeted. In the way policies were shaped. In the way we listened. And sometimes, when we flew together, I'd catch the crew exchanging quick looks after reading our boarding passes. A subtle glance. A second glance. But never doubt. Just recognition. And respect. One afternoon, on a quiet flight between New York and Seattle, a young flight attendant approached with a soft smile. Miss Thompson, she said gently, I just wanted to thank you. I joined because of what you stood for, and I stay because of how you lead. Nia smiled back. Then we're doing something right. As the plane lifted off, I looked out the window beside her. The sky stretched wide and steady. The engines hummed. And in that silence, I realized something I'd always known but never said out loud. Sometimes the most important flights we take don't happen in the air. They happen in the hearts we move, one person at a time.